Hello, everyone. I'm watching all of your chats come through when all of the places that we are together tonight. This is delightful. I am so excited. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is my joy and honor to welcome you all to this important conversation tonight, wherever you are and all the places that you are. My name is Seth Patterson, and I'm the Minister for Spiritual Formation and Theater here at Plymouth Congregational Church in Minneapolis. We are a progressive church on the southern edge of downtown Minneapolis, and we've been in existence for 160 years. And on behalf of our clergy, our staff, our leadership, and congregation, we welcome you and we stand with you in hope. Wherever you are right now, wherever you've been in your life, wherever you're going, we are all in this together, and you are welcome here. For our part here, this event has been planned and sponsored by our Climate and Environmental Justice Group. This dynamic group of curious, thoughtful, and loving people has helped our community and our building to do necessary and helpful things. And most recently, we have achieved our goal of having 100% of our electricity come from renewable sources. And we have done this by having rooftop solar panels on our building and subscriptions to both solar and wind farms. And we occupy a whole square block of city. And our intention is to be a model for how other blocks of city can achieve their potential and cause the least amount of harm. Before I introduce our co-host, here's a few pieces of housekeeping. The restrooms are down the hall from wherever you're sitting, and the snacks are in the cabinets. And be sure when you get some to bring enough to share with all of us. Also, probably more importantly, after Jon Foley's presentation, we will have time for questions, and we will do this by way of the Q&A function in Zoom. We will use the chat for exactly what you're doing right now, talking to each other, asking questions, technology questions, questions of each other, but questions for Jon Foley after his presentation will only be read from the Q&A. We have some people to help you if you put it in the wrong place, find the right place, but that is how we will do the Q&A. And I will act as the interlocutor with Jon and read your questions to him. When I first read the Drawdown book a couple years ago, it gave me such hope that I found myself picking it up again and again whenever I needed an antidote to the news, to the statistics, to whatever was happening. I needed hope, so I looked and read about solutions. Maybe that's why you're all here tonight too. We're finding hope and solutions. Tonight's event is being co-hosted by the Central Minnesota chapter of the Climate Reality Project, and I am eager to introduce you to the chapter co-chair, Charlie Cox. Charlie?
Hey, thank you so much, Seth. As Seth stated, my name is Charlie Cox, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Central Minnesota chapter of the Climate Reality Project. As you may know, the Climate Reality Project was founded in 2006 and is still led by Nobel laureate and former Vice President Al Gore. Today, there are chapters in over 139 countries, 49 U.S. states, and 6 territories, and there are close to 40,000 trained climate reality leaders fighting to combat climate change. Our chapter is a diverse group of passionate individuals who have come together to solve the greatest challenge of our time, climate change. We are Minnesota and Western Wisconsin activists, cultural leaders, business people, scientists, and storytellers committed to building a sustainable future together. Our mission is to spark urgent action and rapid adoption of solutions to the climate crisis across every sector of society, to implement policies that promote clean, renewable energy sources and restoration of a balanced carbon cycle. Our focus is to educate the public and government about climate science and solutions, to build coalitions with other climate activists, and conduct issue advocacy campaigns to bring about the rapid and just implementation of climate solutions at the local, state, and national levels. You can find out a lot more about our chapter, our programs, access resources, as well as join by visiting our website at climaterealitymsp.com. So I can't think of a better example of helping fulfill our mission than the educational program we have tonight on Achieving Drawdown, featuring Dr. Jonathan Foley, the Executive Director of Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown is one of the world's leading resources for climate solutions. Its mission is to help the world reach drawdown. That's the point in the future when levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline, thereby stopping catastrophic climate change as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. In addition to being executive director of Project Drawdown, Dr. Foley is a leading climate scientist, sustainability expert, educator, and public speaker. His work focuses on finding solutions to sustain the climate, ecosystems, and the natural resources we all depend on. His work has led him to become a trusted advisor to governments, foundations, nonprofits, and business leaders around the world. He and his colleagues have made contributions to our understanding of climate change, the global food system, and the sustainability of the world's resources. He has published over 140 scientific articles, including many highly cited works in Nature and Science. He earned his PhD from the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at the University of Wisconsin, and he's among the top 1% most cited scientists in the world. A noted science communicator, his presentations have been featured at hundreds of venues, including the Aspen Institute, the World Bank, the National Geographic Society, the Chautauqua Institution, the Commonwealth Club, the National Science March, and TED. He has also written many popular pieces in National Geographic, the New York Times, The Guardian, and Scientific American. He's appeared on National Public Radio, the PBS NewsHour, the BBC, CNN, and the New York Times, The Guardian, the Washington Post, Wired, and the HBO documentary Too Hot Not to Handle, as well as the film series Let Science Speak. He has won numerous awards and honors, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, awarded by President Clinton, the J.S. McDonald Foundation's 21st Century Science Award, an Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellowship, Sustainability Science Award, and the Ecological Society of America, and the National Science Foundation's Faculty Early Career Development Award. He was also named as a winner of the prestigious Heinz Award for the Environment. Before joining Project Drawdown, he led a number of environmental science and sustainability organizations. At the University of Wisconsin, he launched the Center for Sustainability in the Global Environment and served as the first Gaylord Nelson Professor of Environmental Studies there. He was also the founding director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota, where he was the Ignite Presidential Chair for Sustainability. More recently, he served as the executive director of the California Academy of Sciences, which is the greenest science museum on the planet. Before turning the program over to John, I want to let you know that we will have ample time for questions and answers following the presentation, as Seth mentioned before. Thank you all again for attending this event tonight. And with that, I couldn't be more delighted and honored to introduce Dr. Jonathan Foley, Executive Director of Project Drawdown. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Charlie, for the very kind and warm introduction. That's very, very nice of you. Are we all set there? Here we go. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Charlie, again, for the wonderful introduction and for having me here today. It's also really nice to be, I wish we could be sharing our time together in person, perhaps in Minneapolis. I now have moved back to Minneapolis area. I now live in Owatonna, Minnesota, after having spent about 6 years in San Francisco. So back in the Midwest and back to my roots here in the kind of Wisconsin, Minnesota area, which I really, really enjoy. So again, thanks for having me. And I'm going to be showing kind of a presentation about climate change solutions. And then we're going to have hopefully a lot of great conversation and Q&A afterward. So let's look forward here. First, I'm going to share some slides and there we go. Okay, well, so this evening we're going to talk about the idea of how can we stop climate change and do what we call achieving drawdown. So we're going to be looking into the future about how we can stop one of the Earth's most important challenges today. But in order to understand how we can change the future, we have to get a little bit of an understanding of how we got here in the first place. And we humans have changed the world forever. Since our inception, we've been modifying the environment during our early evolution, in fact. Whether it's hunting and gathering, discovering fire, inventing agriculture, we always change the environment kind of near us and around us at a local level. But in the last few decades or so, especially in the last 5 decades, we've seen an unprecedented change in the global environment because humans' footprint has just dramatically increased in the last few decades. One way, of course, is through our sheer numbers. There are many more of us walking the planet today than ever. We also have become an urban species for the first time. Throughout all of previous human history, we lived mainly in the countryside, but today, well over half of the human population now lives in cities for the first time ever. But the real story here was the rise of a truly global economy, a juggernaut of capitalism, technology, commerce, trade, ideas, and goods and services flowing across the world. And during the last 50 years, yes, the population of the planet increased about twofold, but the economy grew nearly sixfold during the same time. So yes, there are more of us, but we're all doing a lot more stuff as a collective body of people. Together, the population and economic growth of the last 5 decades has tripled our demand for food, about doubled our demand for water, and nearly tripled our demand for fossil fuels. And what's kind of amazing is that in just the last 50 years or so, we changed more than all previous human history combined in a single lifetime. So this is kind of amazing. And now, not only is our environmental footprint local, it is now global. We're changing an entire planet today. One of the ways that we're doing that is very obvious, changing the landscape around us. Even in the most remote parts of the world, like here in the Bolivian Amazon, we're showing you a picture here in the 1970s of a very remote part of the Amazon, which then if you went back to the same place in 2003, you'd see had been cleared pretty much entirely of forest, growing primarily soybeans, which are being shipped to China as feed for pigs to help supply the increasing pork production demand in China as China's gotten wealthier and more urban. So even in the Amazon, we're clearing rainforest for animal feed and things like that. And altogether, we've now basically lost about 1/3 of all the world's tropical forest cover, which is really, really tragic. We've also changed water resources around the planet. This is a picture of the Aral Sea in the late 60s and early 70s, which is an inland sea in former Soviet Union in Central Asia, surrounded mainly by desert. But the Soviets diverted the two rivers that fed the sea and instead used the water to irrigate the deserts of Kazakhstan, primarily to grow cotton for export. And so today, that's what the Aral Sea looks like. And this change of just overdrafting water supplies is not limited to just the Aral Sea. We see it in the Colorado River. We see it in California. We see it in Iran. We see it in Lake Chad. We see it pretty much all over the world. So before we even get to changes to the atmosphere, we humans are disrupting land and water and biodiversity at a global scale today, unlike anything we've ever seen. But then we get to the atmosphere, the oceans, the Earth's climate system. That too is changing because of us. But the changes in the atmosphere were a little more subtle at first because the gases we're adding to the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, methane, and others, they are inherently invisible to our eyes. They're transparent to visible light, to solar radiation. That's how they work. And so we couldn't see this pollution in the atmosphere, but we, yes, are adding a lot of it, and it's warming our planet. Well, what's interesting is that the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere looks something like this. We've caused about a 50% increase in the level of CO2 in the air, and it's now higher than it's been for at least 3 to 5 million years. We've done the same to a lot of other gases, it turns out, too, not just carbon dioxide, but this is the big one. Well, carbon dioxide has increased by about 50%, and I drew this graph starting in the 1850s, partly because that's where the data begin, but also that's when the science begins. When I was a grad student, I was taught there was a British male scientist named Joseph Tyndall who first proposed the idea that if we burn too much fossil fuels, it would warm the planet. And he wrote a paper about this in the 1860s. That's what all meteorology and climate students were taught for years. Turns out that it's wrong. It actually was an American woman named Eunice Foote, Foote, who first published a paper showing in about 6 years before Tyndall, by the way, showing that increasing CO2 would warm the planet. And she published her work in 1854. Kind of incredible. She did build on the work of a guy named Joseph Fourier, the French physicist and mathematician in the 1830s, who talked about the kind of generic idea of a greenhouse effect, but not that we humans could change it. But back in 1854, an American woman scientist named Eunice Foote was the first to talk about it. And she wasn't even allowed to present her paper. Her husband had to do it for her. That's a shame, and we really need to remember her more properly in American scientific history. And so I like to mention this every chance I get. So when we see CO2 rising in the atmosphere, we know that it will trap heat and warm the planet. A lot of you have taken the climate reality training. You know this very well and could teach it as well as I can. But what we've seen is about a 1 degree Celsius warming, maybe 1.1 degrees now, has happened since the rise of these levels of CO2. It is no longer even debatable that the human greenhouse effect is happening, that we are warming the planet. We're past that debate now. Now it's really a question, what do we do about it? Well, I want to say one thing, though, before we get started into solutions. That it'd be very easy to listen to the news and listen to environmental groups and politicians and media people who, by the way, are basically making a living off of scaring the hell out of us sometimes. We have to remember that for every bad piece of news, there's probably 2 good pieces of news that you never heard about. So while it may seem hopeless to deal with climate change, let me assure you that it's not. We can, in fact, change the course of our future and live in a more sustainable world than the one we're headed towards. Yes, we have warmed the planet already 1 degree. We can't undo that right now. And we've lost countless species, and we have degraded countless ecosystems around the world. That's undeniable. But tomorrow begins today. We can always change the future by acting better today. We can always chart a better course from where we are. So Project Drawdown is really about how do we chart that better course? How do we stop climate change from getting a lot worse than it already is? If we do nothing, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, but we can choose a different path. And that's what Drawdown's all about. So what is Drawdown? Well, Charlie kind of defined it for us. Drawdown is basically reflected here. Greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, but others as well, we humans have caused them to increase in the atmosphere like this curve shows. Right now, if we extrapolate where we're going at the moment, we just keep climbing and climbing and climbing. And the higher that curve goes, the warmer the planet gets, the more messed up our weather systems and ecosystems and water and everything else will get. And that's really bad. We don't want that. So what we need to do is bend the curve. Just like we've been trying to do with the pandemic, we're headed towards one bad road. Take a turn, bend the curve, and go in a different direction. That's what we need to do with greenhouse gases too. And once we hit that blue dot, that's the moment of drawdown. It's the moment when greenhouse gases stabilize in the atmosphere. They don't go up anymore, and then they start to maybe slowly go down. When that moment happens, that's the moment we stop additional warming to the planet, and we can stop climate change in its tracks. And long term here, we might begin the slow process of reversing climate change too. So how do we get there? How do we get to drawdown? Well, first we have to kind of reverse these 3 curves. These are 3 of the most important greenhouse gases we emit: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. There are actually hundreds of others. And we have to turn them all down and bend the curves on these things and get them basically flat and moving back down again. So we have to know where they come from in order to do that. So here's a little bit of the science that we should all understand if we're going to tackle climate change. First and foremost, the lion's share of greenhouse gases is CO2 coming from burning fossil fuels. That contributes about 60 to 62% of the climate change we're experiencing today. That's the lion's share, but it's not the whole story. It's about 60%. That means about 40% is other stuff, and that's a lot. So some of the other things that contribute to climate change include things like cement and industrial chemical processes that release CO2 without burning anything. It turns out when cement is curing, it releases CO2 into the atmosphere, just from chemistry, not from energy use. That's important. We have CO2 emitted from deforestation and other land use practices, like burning down trees isn't that different than burning carbon in coal or oil or gas. They're all made out of carbon, just some's dead and some of it's alive. They both put CO2 in the air. That number is astonishing. 11% of the warming we see today is still coming from deforestation and land use. The United States greenhouse gas emissions as an entire nation is about 12% and dropping. This is 11% and climbing again. So this is basically equivalent to the entire country of the United States in terms of emissions, yet we don't hear about it enough. We also have methane, another critical greenhouse gas that warms very quickly and warms a lot, molecule for molecule, but then it fades away after a few decades. But it's still really important. Most of that comes from agriculture, from cattle. We all know about cow burps and things like that. Also a little bit from rice fields. And then a lot of the methane we also now call natural gas or fossil gas comes from the energy industry through leaking natural gas pipelines or fracking or abandoned wells where that methane is just pouring into the atmosphere. We need to fix that and fix it in a hurry. There's another greenhouse gas we don't hear nearly enough about called nitrous oxide or N2O. Those of us in the Midwest, this is actually one of our biggest sources. We don't talk about it much. It turns out N2O mainly comes from agriculture, and it comes when we overuse fertilizer and manure on our farm fields. Some of that excess nitrogen in the fertilizer and manure combines with air and water and forms nitrous oxide going into the atmosphere. Some of the rest becomes nitrate pollution, which pollutes our waterways and rivers and streams and lakes. So nitrogen pollution and fertilizers are a big deal to climate and to water. Then we have some more exotic gases, one of which are called fluorinated gases. These are mainly found in things like refrigerants and insulators and things like that. They're only about 2% of what's causing today's warming, but they're projected to grow enormously as more parts of the world use air conditioning and refrigeration. We need to get a handle on that and make sure we can replace those chemicals with something that don't leak into the atmosphere, causing more warming, but also manage them far better and recycle or chemically destroy what's been abandoned. So anyway, that's a little bit of the chemistry of what's happening. Carbon dioxide from fossil fuels, but also from industrial chemicals and materials, and a lot of stuff from agriculture and land use. It's not just energy, folks. It's energy, food, and materials are what cause climate change, really. Well, that's the chemistry part. Now let's turn it into something a little bit more real. We humans pour all this greenhouse gas stuff into the atmosphere, and primarily comes from about 6 different places. And we'll walk through those a little bit later. But things like making electricity, transportation, food, buildings, things like that. So those are the sources of greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere. But the atmosphere doesn't sit still, just waiting for our pollution. In fact, the atmosphere has its own physics and chemistry, and it interacts with the biology of our world, especially on land, in the forest, and in productive parts of the ocean. So it turns out that nature removes about 40% of the pollution we put in the atmosphere. It removes over 50% of the carbon dioxide part. So this is really important. These are what are called carbon sinks, what nature is doing for us all the time and has for centuries. The problem here is it still leaves some pollution behind. About 59 to 60% of our greenhouse gas pollution stays in the atmosphere at the end of the year and is building up year upon year upon year, causing the warming to get bigger and bigger all the time. But basically, we put in about 100 units of stuff in the air, causing warming. Nature takes out about 40, leaves behind roughly 60. And that's the picture of the last few decades or so. To achieve drawdown and stop climate change, we've got to work on both sides of this equation. First and foremost, we got to take the sources of the greenhouse gases and bring them to zero. Not net zero, real zero. Zero like you learned in kindergarten, the real zero number, not a made-up one. We're going to take all of those sources of greenhouse gases and bring them to real zero as soon as we possibly can. This will be very hard in some cases, but some of it's actually relatively easy and good for us and very economical right now. The trick will be to sort all that out. We also have to maintain and support nature's sinks of carbon. We have to figure out how to keep healthy oceans and healthy forests intact. So whatever we do emit, some fraction of that can still be absorbed by nature and help us out a little bit. So basically, reduce pollution and support natural areas are the 2 biggest areas to think about with climate change. So let's walk through them. Let's see what we can do. Let's see how we can stop climate change together. So reducing the pollution from the source right from the beginning, we have to look at each area of pollution. 25% of the global greenhouse gas emissions come from making electricity, burning coal, natural gas, and so on. That's what we're talking about here in electricity production. By the way, the numbers I'm going to show you are for the entire globe. They vary a lot from country to country, state to state, even city to city, depending on what you do and what's going on in your town and what kind of power sources you have and all that. But globally, where it all adds up to the entire atmosphere, a quarter of climate change is being caused by making electricity. Interestingly, another quarter of climate change, and we don't hear about this enough, is simultaneously being caused by making food. Our agriculture, land use, and other kinds of practices in the food system contribute also roughly a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. We'll get back to that in a second. Then we have industry kind of making stuff like steel, cement, plastics, chemicals, and so on, but also processing the world's waste in wastewater, solid municipal waste, and so on. That's a pretty big player too. Then we've got transportation, cars and trucks and airplanes and trains and boats and all that kind of stuff. Buildings directly from the buildings themselves, from furnaces, boilers, hot water heaters, air conditioning units that are leaking, things inside the building envelope. That's about 6% of global emissions. But the built environment as a whole is a lot bigger, obviously, because a lot of the electricity we use goes into buildings, and a lot of the transportation we do is between buildings, and buildings are made out of stuff produced in industry. So it turns out the built environment as a whole, not just individual buildings, are really, really important here. Then we got everything else, including processing oil, refining oil, and so on, fugitive emissions, things like that, a lot of that in the energy industry, and a few other odds and ends. But on one hand, we've got 90% of the problem: electricity, food, industry, transportation, and buildings. We got 90% all right here. We can tackle that. So let me show you a few examples of how we can stop climate change in each of these different areas. Electricity, again, quarter of the problem, because the way we produce electricity, the supply of electricity, is still very dirty. In much of the world, we're burning coal and fossil gas to make electricity. We don't need to do that. Also, we could cut down the amount of electricity we use in the first place, be more efficient with what we've got. So we both have supply side and demand side solutions in the electricity sector. And it turns out in all the other sectors too. But in electricity, we can identify places where we can cut the use of electricity with energy efficiency, especially in buildings and in industry. So when we think about climate solutions, I like to start with efficiency because they're often the quickest to deploy. We can usually do them like right now and save money while we're doing it. So here are a number of climate solutions in energy efficiency in the electricity sector. A lot of them are familiar, like better lighting, better building envelopes, building materials, hot water systems, and so on. Those are all really, really crucial right here. Each circle is one climate solution. The bigger the circle is, the bigger we think that solution could be over the next 3 decades. We then looked at ways of producing electricity differently, including wind and solar, everybody's favorites. Oops, sorry. But we also have biomass, we have methane capture, we have a little bit of nuclear here, we have a whole bunch of other things. We need to be very open to lots of ways of producing electricity, but right now we think the best technologies in terms of cost, reliability, and speed of growth will be wind and utility scale solar, as well as distributed solar on rooftops. Those are going to be very, very powerful. But we also need improved energy storage, of course, for some of these things. Well, then we get into other areas. If we just do the electricity sector, we've only looked about a quarter of the problem. We've got to look at the other 3/4 as well, including agriculture and land use and food. That's 24% of the problem. Globally, most of that still comes from deforestation, burning down rainforest in like the Amazon or Indonesia to grow things like beef, palm oil, animal feed, and so on. Things the world probably doesn't really need more of, but we're tearing down rainforests to do it anyway. Also, animal agriculture by itself, methane, is a major problem. Methane from cattle is about 5% of all climate change right there alone, plus the land use and other things that cattle produce. It's estimated that red meat altogether on the planet contributes about 14% of all of our climate change problems comes from overeating beef. Well, that's a big issue, and we can talk about that. But methane alone from animals is about 5%, from rice it's about 1%. And then we have overuse of fertilizers, especially the nitrous oxide issue from fertilizers and manure on all sorts of lands around the world. So that's where the pollution comes from. How can we solve it? Again, efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. 40% of all the food grown on the planet is never even eaten. So cutting back food waste is a huge opportunity, because if 40% of the food isn't eaten, that means 40% of the land, 40% of the water, and 40% of the greenhouse gases weren't even necessary. We can get additional savings by tuning our diets a little bit to be a bit more plant-rich based diets. This doesn't mean everybody becomes a vegan or anything. That's not going to happen. And there's some people in the world culturally and economically depend on meat for their diets, and that's fine. But a lot of the world, we could dial down our meat consumptions, especially when the doctors are telling us to do so anyway. And that could be a big help, it combined with reducing food waste in general. Then we can do things to protect ecosystems from being cleared, so we don't clear a rainforest to grow a bit more cow or animal feed or palm oil. And then we can farm better on the lands we already use and do so in ways that are more sustainable and perhaps even what's called regenerative, ways that could actually build back soils, which could be very interesting. Then we have emissions from industry. I won't go through these in as much detail, but the industry sector is very important, about 21% of all emissions. But this is a complicated one. This has got a lot of different moving parts. Some of these are going to be hard to decarbonize later, but we can. They're going to involve metals, especially steel. That's a big one. Cement, I've already mentioned. Chemicals, including plastics. Plastics today, the production, use, and disposal of plastics about 1.5% to 2% of climate change right now. It could grow fairly substantially, but not huge numbers, but they're still really important. And they can still also cause other environmental problems of plastic pollution in the ocean and waterways and so on. So that's kind of a win-win if we can rethink plastic. It helps everything. Processing waste, whether it's wastewater or solid waste, believe it or not, is also 3% of climate change right there. So that's another important area too. Then we have transportation. About 14% of the emissions globally come from transport. Most of that's from roads. Flying is about 2% of climate change, and that includes the military as well. That's all aviation, commercial and military. That may not sound like a lot, but considering how few people fly a lot, and most of us don't, that's a disproportionately large number for some folks, and that's something we definitely need to think about too. Then we get into buildings. Again, buildings use electricity. We've already looked at that. They're made out of stuff from industry. They also determine a lot of our transportation needs. But buildings themselves on site also release about 6% of greenhouse gases. And it's 2 to 1 residential buildings to commercial buildings. Our homes and apartments matter a lot here, folks. And we've got to do a lot to tighten those up and heat them and cool them better. Then we get into the other side of the street. We've talked about all the ways we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But then I reminded you that 40% of those emissions are absorbed roughly by the atmosphere into forest and into the oceans, what are called carbon sinks. Sometimes we call that carbon removal. Despite all the hoopla and news articles and Silicon Valley tech bros telling us how wonderful these machines are going to be, carbon removal machines essentially don't exist on this planet. There's a lot of talk about them and lots of photos of them, but they don't even get measured in the atmosphere, because even if you could have 1 million times more than we already have today, they would still not be measurable in the atmosphere. They're that small. It turns out by a lion's share, all of the carbon removal on this planet today is being done by nature. We haven't even made a dent in that, and it can't even be measured in the atmosphere. The other thing I want to point out to kind of put a little bit of a wet blanket in all the hoopla of carbon removal machines is that technology is already 50 years old. It's a fan blowing air through a solvent that dissolves carbon dioxide into it. I don't know where the technology breakthrough is. Are there disruptions to the fan industry I haven't heard about yet, or to sulfuric acid or something? I don't see that really becoming a game changer anytime soon. Maybe it will, but it's going to take a long time with fundamentally different technologies. In the meantime, it's been a giant waste of money, time, and resources and attention. But right now, the safe bet is to protect our forest and to protect our oceans, because those are the places absorbing carbon today. And we know that works, and it's worked for billions of years. And down the road, yes, maybe we'll design ways that machines can absorb carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases too, but right now they're just laughably small and getting way more attention than they deserve. So I put that on the back shelf for a while for me. So we've looked at ways of reducing pollution, supporting nature so it absorbs some more carbon, all good stuff. A third area we haven't talked about yet is kind of unintentional climate solutions, things that we do that improve society for its own sake, as we should, that sometimes have cascading benefits back to our climate problem. This is kind of cool. So there might be ways we can improve society that turn out to then later affect climate change in a positive way. For example, we've seen how improving healthcare and education access to developing countries, especially for women and girls, can have profound climate benefits. Also, helping indigenous communities, especially around tropical forest, for example, help maintain their lands and their land tenure helps preserve some of those important forests that are absorbing carbon for us. So there are a lot of things we should do because they're the right thing to do for people, but it turns out they have some additional benefits to climate as well. Anyway, so when we put together the whole big picture here, we can see all sorts of things we can do here. And these are all existing solutions, no new inventions here at all. Everything I'm talking about is on the shelf today. So we have enormous opportunities to reduce emissions around electricity, agriculture, industry, transportation, and buildings. A lot of them are pretty low tech. Some are kind of harder to do and may require new technologies that would help a lot too. But right now we can do all of it with tools we have today. New tools would help too, but we don't have to wait for them. We can also support natural carbon sinks, especially on land. That little blue dot, we're about to update those numbers and see much bigger blue areas in the oceans where we can help manage coastal oceans in ways that preserve and maybe augment carbon sinks in the nature's oceans. And then what I mentioned before, things that are intended to improve society that can in addition help us with climate change. Of course, we can do more there too. And if we put all these solutions together, I know it's a tired metaphor, but there's no silver bullet to climate change, but there's a lot of that silver buckshot laying around. And if we use all of it, we can change the future. We can change the course we're on right now, which looks something like this. Two different curves. We can bend that curve to that yellow one and that green one, where we can actually stop climate change maybe as early as the mid-2040s if we're really ambitious, or in the 2050s, or maybe the early 2060s. Those are all still choices that we can make now if we wanted to. And if we did that, we can change the future. We can keep the world from warming into this catastrophic 2.5, 3, 4, 5 degrees of warming, which would be terrible for us. Or we can choose to have worlds like this, where the warming is limited to 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. Those are still possible. Those are choices we can make if we choose to do them now. The longer we wait, though, the harder it is to bend the curve so quickly to land on these places. Now, sadly, it is impossible to stop climate change below 1 degree because we've already passed it. But it is still possible to limit it from 1.5 to 2 degrees. The Paris Accords take a lot of work, but it is still doable starting now. So what have we learned? Well, the first thing I hope we've learned is not too late to stop climate change from getting a lot worse. Yep, some of it's already here, but we can stop it from getting tons worse by acting now. So the doomsday narratives of like, it's too late, we're going to have runaway warming, there's nothing we can do, is nonsense and is not helpful. In fact, it's another delay tactic the oil companies and others just love. So don't fall for that. We are not at doomsday. We're at a point in the road that forks, and we can choose what we want to do, a better world or a world that could be pretty terrible. But the choice is still ours. We also have enough solutions today to stop climate change. We have all the tools we need right now, and we'll get more tools as we go. It's great. We've got a big fat toolbox full of things, and people are adding hammers and nails and tape measures and levels to it all the time. We'll get more tools. That's great. And what's really good is most of the solutions to climate change that I see actually make the world better in lots of other ways too. They create jobs. They create healthier communities with cleaner air, cleaner water, cleaner landscapes. They can, if deployed wisely, also help reduce inequities and injustices of the past by rebooting our transportation, our buildings, our communities, and everything else to be more fair, to be more equitable. So if we do climate change solutions right, we just made the world better by rebooting things. We get to redo everything for the 21st century instead of running a world on the ideas and technologies and power structures of the 19th century. We don't need to do that anymore. But we do have to move quickly. Time is not our friend here. In order to stay below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees of warming, we basically have to do the following. We have to take that red curve, those greenhouse gas emissions, which have been going up and up and up over the years. We've got to bend them steeply downward and cut them basically in half within a decade or so, and then cut them in half again and in half again, roughly by between now and 2050. During that same 30 years, we can also see the growth of some more carbon removal, probably more in forest and soils, I think, but maybe some machines too, out by the 2040s. And that's when we're going to hit kind of net zero by 2050 or so. But to do this, we can't wait around. If we're going to cut something in half in 10 years, I'd like to know what we're doing this year and next year and the next 3 years. We need some quick wins, folks, that take those emissions down immediately in ways that we can deploy today, not tomorrow, not next year, today. What do we do right now? Some of those are going to be obvious, things like stopping deforestation, stopping the leaks of methane or refrigerants into the atmosphere that we don't need to do, just tightening up our pipelines and stuff would help a lot. Or they could be dramatic gains in energy efficiency that we can do right now in buildings and homes, fuel efficiency, things like this. Those would all help like today, and we can do a lot of that right now. We also, though, have to do the big work of rebuilding the world's infrastructure. Our electrical grids, our transport systems, our food systems, our industries, our built environments, our public buildings, all of that stuff will need massive remodeling, updating, and replacement. And that's going to cost trillions of dollars globally and probably take a few decades to complete. So we better start now. And we can do that alongside the work we're doing on the quick wins. We got to do those in parallel. We also can plant trees and restore soils and build better carbon sinks. But trees and soil take time. If you're planting a tree to offset your emissions from this year, the problem is the emissions you burned this year warm the planet right now. The tree absorbs the carbon 30 to 50 years from now. In the meantime, all that warming keeps on going. So we have to be very careful about these natural carbon sinks. Use them, plant them now, but realize they don't kind of kick in and absorb stuff out of the air really until 20, 30, 40 years from now. We also have new game-changing technologies that are maybe going to happen down the road. Some of them are risky. A lot of them will never work, but some of them will, and they could change the world. But they will take time to invent, to test, to scale, and bring to the scale we need around the world. So those begin today too, but also move into the future. So when I look at this graph, I see we've got to do quick actions right now, also work with infrastructure, also work with nature, and also have really good R&D investments. And we need to have all 4 of those waves of climate action starting today, working synergistically in parallel into the future. And that will help get the job done. The other thing I want to remind you of, and maybe we'll leave on these points here and then get to some conversation and Q&A, is yes, addressing climate change is an incredible challenge. It's one of the hardest things we'll probably ever do. But it is also the best opportunity to build a better world that we'll ever have. It is the opportunity of 1,000 years to rebuild not just what we do with energy and stuff, it's to rethink everything. How we live, how we share our resources, how we grow our food, how we relate to an entire planet, how we relate to each other, how we relate to everyone who will come after us. This is an opportunity to build a better world, but also I think a chance to be a better people than we've ever been. And I want to seize that opportunity and live in that world. And I think you do too. And we get to reimagine this world. It isn't that we have to address climate change, like, oh gosh, I got to take out the trash, some big chore we have to do. I'm excited about this. We get to address climate change. What a great opportunity to rethink all the bad stuff in the world and do it better. Maybe we could all do this together. It'd be pretty fun. So here's my ask of you tonight. Let's all learn more and share what we're learning. because no one person, no one organization, no one team could ever be the sole answer to climate change solutions, to know everything we need to know. We need to learn what's working and share that like crazy. I mentioned this already, but one of the things that really worries me about climate change is that for every bad piece of news, there are 2 or 3 good pieces of news you're never hearing anything about because it doesn't sell on TV or Twitter. It doesn't get activist money or attention. It doesn't play into the hands of industry. We're only hearing all the bad news, and there's plenty of that. And I know that that's true. But there's a lot of good news too. And maybe it's up to us to find it, share that, and model it so we can scale it as quickly as possible. What's happening in all of your communities? Maybe drop something into the chat. Where do you think the best climate work in your town is today? And how do we share that with all the other towns who are on this call tonight? That would be great. Let's all learn and share good ideas, because folks on Twitter and on cable news aren't going to do it for us. We have to do that. And I'd ask us to all exercise our leadership. If we just wait for the elected politicians to do the work for us, we are really out of luck. I mean, honestly, do we think the United Nations and the US Congress are going to run to the rescue and save us all? What movie are you watching? I don't think so. It's all of our leadership. It's our organizations at the community level, as well as states and cities. It's our neighborhoods. It's our faith communities, our schools, our businesses, everybody working together at all levels of leadership that'll get this done. So let's remember we're all leaders and we're all followers at the same time, and see what we can do together. And finally, I just want to implore us all to remember that the future is never finished being written. It's always being redrafted and shaken on the etch a sketchboard and written again. And I like this quote: "The future is up for grabs. It belongs to any and all who will take the risk and accept the responsibility of consciously creating the future they want." So let's go forth tonight and think about the future we want and see how we can seize that and begin to bend some curves into a better direction, or even a more sustainable future, but also a kinder, more just, and more equitable future for all of us, and how we can do that and all take some responsibility for making the future we want together. So with that, I will stop here and turn off the little presentation and turn it over to Seth, who will be moderating our little Q&A and conversation this evening. And I hope to spend most of the rest of the time in conversation. So thanks very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Foley. That was wonderful. And we are all clapping for you all around the country. Almost 300 screens are clapping. Thank you for that. There are more questions than we will have time to answer. So I apologize up front if your question, which is good, we're not going to get to it tonight. I'm going to try to combine as many as I can. But one of the downsides of this Zoom question and answer is that I can't move them to get them next to each other. So, but Dr. Foley, to begin, just a very practical thing. Elie Wiesel once said, "To hear a witness is to become a witness." And we have so many witnesses here to this presentation. And a very practical question that Eugenie asked is, would it be possible to use some of these slides for our own presentations? What are the permissions needed to actually help spread this? So, because you are just one person, but we're a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm actually typing into the chat right now, but I mistyped it. There it is. We created an online course called Climate Solutions 101. If you go to drawdown.org, and it'll be right on the homepage, but if you want the full URL, it's drawdown.org/climate-solutions-101. And I put the link in the chat there. It includes 6 videos where I'm presenting this material, but a lot more of it, but also all the accompanying visuals. So you can download the individual graphics slide by slide and use them however you want to. So it's a free public license. We just keep the Drawdown word mark on it so people know where it came from, in case we have to update it or people want to know where did that slide come from. But yeah, we have a couple dozen of those key slides I just showed tonight are available there. And you can also point to other things like that. We don't yet have like a climate solutions reality project where we have a whole slide deck and an Al Gore kind of and a team out there training people to give their own presentations, but we definitely want to make sure the visuals are available and some video references are available for people to use themselves, and also some readings and other things. So great question. And yeah, we are definitely going to be doing that. Also, if you could help spread the word to other climate reality folks or other people in other communities you're connected to about Climate Solutions 101 at Project Drawdown, we're so impressed by the Climate Reality Project. It's done a wonderful job on helping people identify the climate problem and all the big picture stuff around this. But one area that needs a little more expansion in the accordion, if you will, of all this work is around solutions. So that's what we contributed, is a little piece there around the kind of science behind climate solutions and where they are today. And we're very, very happy to collaborate and share that stuff with anybody who wants it. That's part of our mission.
Thank you. Thank you. Sue asks that speaking of carbon recapture, that the oceans are no longer capable of absorbing carbon emissions because of saturated, acidic, and warmer waters.
That's actually, that's not quite true. I'm not sure, I didn't see the question, but that is a fear that it could be that in the future, if warming got really, really, really bad, the oceans may slow down how much carbon they're absorbing. Right now, they're still absorbing what they have for decades, thank goodness. But there is a fear there. She's right about maybe a possibility in the future, because one thing is kind of weird. Warmer water actually absorbs less carbon dioxide than cold water. So as the planet warms up, its ability to absorb chemically, just CO2 dissolving in seawater, goes down a little bit. It's kind of funny. The other thing that's more worrying, though, is if we start to kind of damage ocean ecosystems and the biology of the oceans. That's where a lot of the ocean's carbon is being absorbed, is through what's called the biological pump and the carbonate pump. That's ways carbon gets into the oceans, too. Good news is, so far, forests and oceans are still absorbing what they have for a long time, but as the planet gets warmer and more destabilized and we cut down forests and muck up the oceans, those numbers could go down. And so that's a real worry. That's why we have to support nature while we're also reducing emissions, because nature is doing a heck of a big job for us right now, removing 40% of our pollution. So we need to kind of help it along and make sure it can continue to do that. It isn't guaranteed that those sinks of carbon are just going to be fine forever. And so that's the meat of what Sue's question is absolutely a worry. Thankfully, the good news is right now it doesn't seem to be happening at the moment of weakening those carbon sinks. But that's why we want to redouble our efforts to preserve them wherever we can. But also their biological diversity and the communities that live and depend on those systems are also critical, not just their carbon. So, stewarding nature better is something we have to be thinking about, not just changing to, battery-powered cars and stuff. We need to do it all.
And with that, several of the questions are about sort of permanent losses, and going off of what you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. At what point the thing is gone? Judy asks, what about the effects of glaciers melting, water rising, and loss of coral reefs, about the permanence of them? Do you have a comment on this? And just glancing in the chats, there's a lot of talking about permafrost and these different things that seem permanently changed, and the fear of it then exacerbating and accelerating.
Yeah, you do hear a lot about that in the media, but you don't from scientists. Right now, there's no evidence for this. The methane coming into the atmosphere right now is entirely of agricultural and industrial origin. Some little pockets of permafrost are melting in the Arctic now, but the amount of methane in the Arctic atmosphere has not appreciably gone up for the last 50 years. It's not any different than other parts of the world. We would know if the permafrost started outgassing vast amounts of CO2, or if the ocean started doing it. It's not happening. And none of the Arctic scientists I talk to are really that worried about that. And we have some feedbacks in there, but they're not like runaway feedbacks like producing a Venus. That's some of the doomsday rhetoric you'll hear more on Facebook than you do in the journals the scientists write in. But it is a worry, but it's not something that most scientists, the National Academy of Sciences actually did a very careful assessment of this. And the vast majority of people working on this are, we got enough bad news. It turns out we don't have the catastrophically bad news of like, oh, wow, this is going to run away and cause even more feedbacks than we've ever anticipated. There's just no evidence to suggest that that's happening. Thank goodness. But it's already bad enough. Getting back to the early part of the question, yeah, we are irreparably losing species. We are irreparably losing some landscapes and water resources. We are committed now to some more sea level rise over the next 1,000 years. No matter what we do, there's going to be quite a bit of sea level rise. Most of that will be very slow and steady, but it's going to keep going long after we stop polluting. The sea level rise will continue for quite a while. So future people are going to be living in a different world than anybody before us. But the sooner we stop it, the better off we're going to be. Look, I mean, I'm not saying everything's rosy, that we can live on Eden again. That ship has sailed.
Right.
But rather than bemoaning that about how bad things have gotten, I want to stop it from getting even worse. I don't want to send up the white flag of surrender on future people and future species and future communities because we got apathetic. Look, we caused this mess. The least we could do is make it from getting any worse. And so I get really kind of cranky, I think, when I hear kind of doomsday language where like, well, we're already kind of screwed. We've already lost so much. What's the point? It's too late. No, it isn't. As long as there's some child left alive on this planet, there's still a redwood on this planet. As long as there's a whale in the ocean, I'm not giving up. Why are you? Don't do that, please. We all need to just roll up our sleeves, get to work. I wish we'd done it earlier as a civilization. We didn't, but we can do the best we can today. And countless people, countless generations after us will thank us for our efforts. They will not look kindly upon us sitting in our hands and saying, well, we thought it was too late, so we sort of gave up. No, that's an immoral stance. I think it's crucial that we do everything we can to pass on to the next generations the best world we can give them. And it's not the best world we inherited. Shame on us. But we have a duty to do at least the best that's physically and biologically possible today. That we can still do. And that, I believe, is a moral imperative for us to move forward with.
Absolutely. That could be our end, but we have more questions.
No,
but that is such an important thing. Things are critical. There are crises, but it is not for us to walk away from because they're hard.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Eric asks a question about when some of the carbon sinks are also the carbon, that some of the solutions and the problems go hand in hand. So he says specifically, isn't clear cutting forests a major source of biomass, including in the Southeast US? Then he includes a link from NRDC. So things like that.
Yeah, we get some twofers out of this thing, which is pretty cool. If we rethink agriculture and how much land we're clearing to grow more crops we don't really need anyway, we save the forests that are already there. And that does two things. It does, first of all, it stops an immediate source of pollution. When we burn down a rainforest, it's an instant pulse of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that is accelerating climate change. It's like, boom, today's emissions went up because we burned down a forest. But also because we burned down a forest, we degraded that sink of carbon we depend on over the next few decades. So that's why preventing deforestation gives you kind of a double whammy of preventing pollution today and preserving nature tomorrow. That's why that's always number one on my list of things to do around climate change is stop deforestation, especially when it's deforestation that isn't helping promote human well-being. There are some very small farmers around the world, scrappy kind of conditions around the world, kind of slash and burn agriculture, where it's almost like people who live under maybe $2 a day who do need to eke out a living. They might clear a little forest to do so. I'm not really worried about that so much. But when we have vast, vast tracts of land clear cut and then turned into soybean fields so we can grow a few more pigs in Asia for pork, or we're raising beef in the middle of the Amazon, are you kidding me? That's like one of the worst trade-offs I can imagine. So we can do better than that. But yeah, deforestation is really critical, both as stopping a source of pollution, but also preserving a sink of it for later. It gives, pay now and get it back forever. It's really great.
Many people, at least in part of their question, if not of their entire question, is around the COP26 and wondering what some are saying the news out of there is depressing, and others are saying, what do you think is happening? And so comments upon this international conversation happening right now.
Yeah. This is my personal opinion anyway. I think, okay, so there have been 26 COP meetings. There'll be a 27th and a 28th, and people seem to like to have these meetings, especially diplomats, CEOs, media people, and celebrities. Scientists don't go to COP meetings for the most part. The real work doesn't happen there. I've never been to one in my entire life, and I don't plan on going because they're a waste of time, in my opinion. It's a UN process. The UN, by definition, is designed to fail because if one country objects to anything, everything stops. That's not how the world really works. I don't understand why we're relying on this UN process anyway, because a lot of things could get done between the EU, the US, China, and India just acting together. We don't need the other 180 countries because we're doing the lion's share of the work on this right now anyway. I mean, these meetings are good, but I wouldn't bet the farm on them. Let's put it that way. Also, there's a lot of preening, a lot of posturing by politicians, the media, celebrities, and CEOs. You're going to find the most egos per capita I've ever seen in my life at a conference like that. So I'm not that interested. It's not my cup of tea. But some of the news coming out of it has actually been pretty good, actually. But again, the media will never tell you that because it doesn't sell ads. It turns out that we've just learned that we had to revise downward all the numbers on greenhouse gas emissions for the last 10 years. We've been overestimating how much we polluted for a while, especially in land use and deforestation. So it turns out that we peaked and maybe leveled off for the last decade. Now, that number has to go to zero, but at least it's not climbing anymore. The emissions we thought were going up and up and up. The first thing they can do is level them off. Then we're going to bring them to zero. But it appears they've been level for about 10 years now. And we didn't even know it until now. That's pretty exciting news. I'm also excited the world is paying more attention to methane, which has been ignored for way too long. It's a hugely important issue for climate change. We're also hearing, again, thankfully, more discussion around deforestation and other things. So I think we're hearing some good news, but I've never once expected a bunch of leaders to hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and save climate, address climate change. They're never going to do that. They were never going to do that, ever. And I can't think of a single problem in the world has ever been solved that way. Going on this point, this is an important point. A lot of us have been brought up to believe that our policymakers in Washington and at the UN are going to save us through our consensus and governance. I don't think that's really true. In the United States, when Barack Obama got elected, remember that people were excited about a cap and trade bill in the first years of his presidency, the Waxman-Markey bill. And when it didn't pass, a lot of people were really upset, saying this is terrible for climate change. Well, guess what actually happened? That law never passed, but if it had a goal of reducing US emissions by about 20% by the year 2020. Well, guess what? The United States cut our emissions without the Waxman-Markey bill by 21% by the year 2020. We now have lower emissions than we've ever had since 2007. We've been lowering them by over 21%, probably more after this year. That's amazing. And it didn't take some grand stroke of a pen of Congress or the White House to get it done. It was a lot of small nudges by the EPA, by regulatory fiat, by executive order, a lot of little things that Obama did that helped, combined with what markets and technology and activism were already doing anyway. Coal's dead, whether the politicians say so or not. Batteries are getting cheaper, whether politicians say so or not. LED lighting, solar panels, they're all getting cheaper, better, and more ubiquitous. It's markets and technology and culture that's really driving the world. The politicians are always the last step. And so I'm not thinking they're going to lead. I think they're going to follow and help amplify and accelerate what's already happening in the first place. So that's why I don't look to COP so much. I'm much more interested in what's happening around solar panel prices or LED lighting or heat pumps. That's what's really changing the world, is when things get better than the old alternatives, people just start using them like crazy and we wonder how the world just changed. So a lot of things that happen in our lives, like gay marriage, electing an African-American president, changes in smoking behavior, drink driving behavior, the collapse of the Soviet Union, blah, blah, blah. Politicians didn't do most of that work. We did. And so that's what I think is happening in climate change. Sorry for the long ramble here, but I think we put way too much attention on the Beltway circus and the media hype and not enough on like what regular folks are doing in climate, which is a lot of good stuff. And there's a lot of good things happening out there. We just need a lot more of it and happening a lot more quickly.
Well, in some ways, you just answered a whole lot of questions, not maybe specifically.
Sorry.
But I mean, that's good. A lot of the questions that are coming in are either what can I do or we do or faith communities or neighborhoods or cities sort of communally? What can we do? What can I do? Or what kind of policies, what kinds of, Biden's doing this or not doing this. The Paris Accord is being met or not met. So in some ways you addressed what I think is the root of a lot of questions. But here's something specific that I'm pulling from two. Donald asks about regenerative agriculture. It says has a lot of potential to draw down CO2 much faster than most people realize, and asks, why is this not one of Project Drawdown's biggest solutions to climate change? And I'm going to,
yeah.
And then there's another one that just talks more, I lost it in the long list of questions, more specifically about just soil generally and its potential.
Well, we do include regenerative agriculture as a climate solution. For the folks who aren't familiar with it, regenerative agriculture is a body of practices that aim to restore our landscapes, to improve the soils and maybe also the biomass of things like trees and shrubs and grasses to be a bit more what like nature had before. Because a lot of our agriculture has kind of strip mined the vegetation off the surface, like trees and shrubs and stuff, but also demean the soil. So they're much lower in terms of organic matter and carbon in the soil than they used to be. So the idea of regenerative agriculture, one of the big ideas is to put all that back. Really good idea. Because not only does it help a bit with climate change, it also makes the soil able to hold moisture better so it doesn't flood or dry out so much. It's also better for biodiversity. It's better for the kind of microfauna in the soils. It's better for wildlife and so on and so on and so on. It's kind of one of the few no regrets things you could do. I'm really a big fan of regenerative agriculture. But from a carbon point of view, there's a huge difference from what scientists are saying about how much carbon can be put back in the soil and in vegetation from regenerative agriculture versus what the proponents of at least a handful of very vocal, very visible proponents of regenerative agriculture are saying without any support or any data. So I worry a lot that there's a small number of people who have a very large megaphone who are massively overhyping the numbers. I won't say who they are, but they're pretty prominent. One has a TED Talk, one founded a bunch of companies around this. And I'm sorry, but the actual scientific community, the people who go out and make these measurements and study them and do all the analysis of the data are shaking their heads saying, whoa, 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 you're inflating these numbers by about 10-fold, or you're cherry picking the one you really like and ignoring the 9 other ones. You can't take the best case example of something and assume it's going to apply to the whole planet. Like, Bill Gates and I walk into a bar doesn't make all of us a billionaire on average, it doesn't work that way. So there's a bit of cherry picking the numbers that's going on, I fear. But that doesn't mean that's not a good solution. It's a really good solution. It might be 5% of the answer, maybe a little bit more. That's great. Let's take it. Drawdown has about 100 climate solutions to get the job done in our book and on our ongoing publications. This one. By definition, that means each one on average is about 1%. We need about 100 of them to get the job done. A few percent here, or 1 or 2% there, or 5% here. Those are huge. But be very skeptical whether it's regenerative agriculture, nuclear, or batteries, or carbon removal. If anybody says, I have the solution to climate change, they're trying to sell you something. You might want to talk to people who've actually run the numbers. And we're one of those groups that runs the numbers. We're kind of like the Consumer Reports for the planet. We're not trying to sell you anything. We're just trying to get the numbers right. And regenerative agriculture is great. We love it. It's fantastic. But just be aware of the overhype in that space right now. I think it's going to correct in the next year or two, but there's a bit of flim-flam in some of the social media and media conversations there. But the science is sound. It works. It's great. Just scale back the numbers a little bit in terms of what we can expect from it and be guaranteed that it works. So just be a little careful.
Speaking of your almost 100 options, Dave asks about number 6. at least in the book, which is educating girls as
Yeah.
part of this. And this ties in with a lot of questions that are really around social structures and playing both climate change and social justice work and racial justice work and gender equality work and all of these things that are so important hand in hand. So can you talk a little bit more about this as the particular in that?
Yeah, I'm really glad people are noticing this kind of stuff because on one hand, we might have a very technological, technocratic view of climate solutions. Like we fixed the sky, we stopped putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's it. And we solved this big environmental problem. Well, we could do that, but it turns out a lot of the things we do to address climate change also prevent opportunities to improve society. Like we can help improve air quality, human health, equity, justice. We can create jobs through a lot of the solutions we deploy. So climate solutions often have cascading benefits back to people. But the reverse is also true. That's what, like we were trying to point out, is that sometimes we do things because it's the right human thing to do, providing better access to education and healthcare for women and girls around the world, helping to lift people out of poverty around the world, helping indigenous communities preserve their land and have land tenure and legal power around the world. All of those things we do because it's morally right for people. But every single one of those actually trickles back to having a good climate benefit too. So what's really nice is we might have virtuous kind of play here between we do something for climate change and it benefits a lot of people, especially folks who've been underserved by previous power structures. And then when we try to do societal interventions that are helpful, some of them also have mutual benefits back to climate. I think the wisdom here will be to try to find those that do all of the above, that have benefits to climate, to the rest of nature, and to all people, especially those who've been disenfranchised for far too long. That will be the trick, is kind of finding how we get the best possible solutions there. We can also avoid mistakes. There are probably some climate solutions that could be very harmful to people, at least some people, just like any of our technologies in the past have been. We hear a lot about like electric cars will need more lithium ion batteries, and the lithium mining industry is kind of messy, it seems, and we need to do better with that. Of course, the fossil fuel companies are the ones promoting that narrative. A lot of people don't realize that, because our current cars and iPhones and everything already are powered with lithium ion batteries. It's not like we're not using lithium today. We are. And your cars, your gas powered cars today also use a lot of other toxic metals into things like catalytic converters and things like this that are also very messy. Overall, electric cars are far better for the environment, but that doesn't mean they're off the hook. It does mean we still have to address the lithium ion battery problem, but we already had to solve that problem, mostly thanks to these bloody things and all the laptops we're using tonight. So we do have some trade-offs to make here and there, but a lot of them we already had, and we need to learn how to do better by doing better.
With this question that was rooted in educating girls, Frank asked something about, I lost it in the thing now. What is the state of climate science education in schools? I think especially younger schools. And then I will add to that the quality of it. So not just how much is being done, but how well is it being done?
Yeah, well, I think it has a ways to go. Of course, I mean, it's something I care about very deeply. I used to run a science museum, for example, because I'm very passionate about science education more broadly. Interesting thing is that about 70% of what Americans learn in their lifetime about scientific issues doesn't happen in a classroom. It happens on like public talks. It happens on National Public Radio by watching Nova or Cosmos or whatever. We have great podcasts. America has some of the worst public education in the world on science, unfortunately, but we have the best informal science education on the planet. So Americans are actually much more scientifically literate than we think they are. In fact, they usually tie South Korea in the world in terms of being the most scientifically literate people in the world. But you wouldn't know that based on test scores of our children. So our K-12 schools really need to do a better job of science education, but thankfully we make up for it later in kind of informal science education, but also we still have the best community colleges, and universities in the world. And almost everybody who does go to college in this country has to take some science classes, which is not true in many other countries. So that's kind of the big picture around science education writ large. On climate education, I think we need to learn more of the basics of the real science. And there's a temptation, it seems, to skip over actually understanding the science and jump right into the activism or the politics. And that's fun and exciting, and people want to do that. But if you don't know what a CO2 molecule actually does, or why methane is different, then you're not doing us any good. You have to learn the science to be helpful here. Not all of it. You don't have to be an expert, but at least take a few hours to learn the basics. Then you can be so much more effective as a business leader, activist, policymaker, activist, culture, whatever, on this issue. And the Climate Reality Project is a great thing there, I think. I'm really excited about what you all do. But in terms of K-12 education, it can be very political, as we all know. Some school boards and some state standards for science are, think climate change is still somehow a controversial topic when it isn't. By the way, 93% of Americans now believe climate change is real. 93%. Show me something that wins that good. Only 7% of Americans are absolutely certain that it's a hoax and it's not real. Probably more think the earth is flat. So I'm happy with that. We're good. Let's move on. So I think science education in general can be better, but it's mixed. It's not so good in our public K-12 schools anymore, especially in middle school. It's also not reaching everybody. But our kind of broader lifelong learning around the country as a whole is actually still pretty good. But we need both to be better. And on climate education, I think there's not enough of it, and it's not good enough. And I worry that we skip over the actual science a little bit too quickly to want to talk about more kind of trendy issues. But I want people to know what a gigaton is. I want people to understand what the carbon cycle does. If that's a science class, do the science, please. Do the work. Then we can be really helpful. I'm really excited about what we can do there, but we need to do better.
Well, this next question kind of fits into some of these, maybe the opposite of that in a way. Mm-hmm. So Anthony asks, how can Drawdown be supported publicly by companies? Mm-hmm. In the way that companies publicly supported other things like the Black Lives Matter movement, which was the largest social movement ever done in the history of this country. He paraphrases it down. How do we get it to blow up on social media and talked about by influencers? How do we make this, in addition to knowing what a gigaton is, how do we make it trendy?
I really wish I knew how to do that. If somebody on this call does know, we'll hire you, right? But yeah, that's an interesting question. But getting back to the company question about companies and so on, we actually do work with some businesses. We are funded by a few too, but we're very picky about who we want to work with because of, there's reputational issues. So we want to make sure there's a genuine commitment, not greenwashing, by people in business who really want to be leaders on climate change. So we've turned down a lot of partners and a lot of funding over the years by people we think are hey, thank you, but no, thanks. We're going to pass on this. We do that a lot, actually. And we're really concerned that business leadership on climate change needs to go beyond kind of vague statements about the year 2050. We'll be net zero by 2050. First of all, what on earth is net zero really? Everybody has a different definition and people can make it be whatever they want. It's kind of a goofy concept. I've never been a fan of it, at least applied to a company or a country. It doesn't make sense. It only makes sense for the planet as a whole.
Because we're interconnected? Is that what you mean?
Right. The atmosphere can be net zero, meaning that the amount of pollution is being also equal by additional removal. So it kind of balances out. But a company, they do these kinds of tricks we're not actually going to cut our pollution. We're going to pay somebody else not to pollute. But at the end of the day, since we all have to cut our emissions, there's nobody left to pay. It's just a giant shell game. And eventually we run out of shells. It just doesn't work. So I think we have to think a little bit more critically about that, but also a goal out of 2040 to 2050. Really? You're the CEO of a major, Fortune 500 company. And if you put out a sales goal that was that vague and that far away, we might be kind of net profitable by the year 2050. You'd be fired instantly by your board and your shareholders. Are you kidding me? Come on. So I want the same kind of accountability that CEOs and other leaders have to their sales, to their shareholders, to their stock price, to their IPOs, to everything that they do. Take carbon as seriously as you take money. In fact, it's far more important. Carbon's real. Money we just made up. That's a human construct. Carbon is real and it lasts forever. We need to do that. So I would like to see an elevation of leadership from businesses, not just to say the right things, but do the right things. So we're starting to work with companies to elevate what climate leadership means. If a company says on one corner of their mouth, we are climate leaders, we commit to being net zero by 2040, but then on the other corner of their mouth, they're giving money to political representatives that oppose climate action. What's going on here? That just seems like it's greenwashing and kind of it's just for appearance's sake. So I want to see more genuine climate leadership and let's hold people accountable, because after all, it's the planet at stake, not just this quarter's earnings. And we can do better. And it's a really bad business model to have an impoverished world. It's not good for anybody, including businesses. Most of all our businesses, they should be leading on this. And thankfully, some of them are. And when they do, the politicians start to follow. That's why I think it's really important to get business on board, because without them, politicians are mostly kind of cowards. They're going to follow others. They're going to follow what businesses say to do, what labor says to do, what we all say to do. And that's going to be really crucial. But if we can get businesses, not all of them, some of them want to stay the way things have been because they're making money that way. But others see that there's a better world and it could be better for them too, just ahead. Think of rebooting the world's energy infrastructure, rethinking all of our transportation, agriculture, materials, recycling, everything. It's like Bill Gates' biggest dream times 1,000 to reinvent the world. This is really good for business if we think about it the right way and are open to new ideas that balance the needs of business, but also the needs of our planet and, of course, of people today and tomorrow. We could do that, and we could have a much better version of capitalism out there if we wanted it. That's for sure.
So you as you mentioned before, you're a scientist, and your organization is data driven, and use the Consumer Reports analogy. Cheryl asks, what about Washington Post report that countries are vastly underreporting carbon emissions? And so does that mean that decisions are being based on bad data? Do you think this is true? Is this true, she says?
It appears to be. There's, I don't know if vastly is the right number, right adjective there. That's what a newspaper will say. I'm not sure it's vastly underestimated. I think what we're finding is there are some voluntary parts of emissions reportings, especially from the energy industry itself, around things like methane leaks. Like if you're going to ask, an oil company, how much are you leaking methane into the atmosphere, and we aren't independently measuring it, they're going to lowball a number, or they're going to give you the best case scenario, or they're not going to look that hard because they want to get penalized for it. So yeah, there are some data issues, especially where there's voluntary reporting of things we can't measure very easily. But that's what scientists are for. We know how much is actually in the air and how much is going in there, and more or less from where, but kind of getting it down to like an individual small country or what part of the economy, that's still kind of tricky. So we definitely need better data to kind of ascribe, to know kind of where these are coming from. But it's a little troubling. I don't think it's deliberate on the government's part, but they do rely on voluntary reporting from some industries, especially the more esoteric greenhouse gases like methane, like nitrous oxide and others. It's pretty hard to get a good number on this. So I think they're all kind of lowballed, and that is worrisome. There was a good article in the Post today about that, which a lot of good scientists contributed to that conversation as well. And it's definitely a concern. For CO2 alone, I think we got those numbers pretty well. I think we have a good handle on those, the bottom-up inventory methods of estimating those versus what we see in the air itself line up very nicely. And there's also some cute tricks that scientists do. We can kind of chemically fingerprint the carbon in the atmosphere and know where it came from. Carbon that came from fossil sources. Well, not too accurately, but we can differentiate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that came from ancient geologic sources, because they're devoid of something called carbon-14, the radioisotope of carbon we call radiocarbon, that we use for radiocarbon dating. When it's coal or natural gas is devoid of radiocarbon-14, we know that that's from fossil fuels. We also know what's from deforestation because of something called carbon-13, which is when it goes through biology, has a different ratio to carbon-12. It's called isotopic chemistry. And it's kind of like a little bit of forensic chemistry we can do in the atmosphere to kind of figure out where stuff comes from. A little harder to do with some of the other gases, and also knowing, where exactly did it come from, Utah or Nevada? Hard to tell when we see just over the middle of North America, somewhere in the atmosphere. So, there are some issues there, but I think better data is always helpful. But in the meantime, we do know what to do: reduce emissions, protect nature. As much as I am a scientist, I would never say stop working on climate change until we have perfect data. Nope, don't do that. If a doctor tells you, hey, you're really sick, we could take more tests. But in the meantime, I suggest you get on this regimen of better health while we're doing more tests. I think you get on the better health regimen right away.
I think we have time for 2 questions, and because we are coming out of time. And thank you all for your these questions. I'm so sad to not be able to get to all of them. One is, and this has come up in a few of them, are there too many people?
No.
Can we sustain our population?
There are far more termites on this planet than there are human beings. It's not a question of the number of animals. Well, right. But that doesn't matter. The population thing is mislabeled very badly. There's no too many people. It's too many people doing too much bad stuff. Like 5% of the planet contributes well over 70% of the emissions right now, within countries and across countries. So which people are we talking about? The average American, let alone the top 1% of Americans, are far more responsible than maybe hundreds of other people combined in other parts of the world. So it's not population at all. Population has never been a driver of big emissions gains. It's what those populations do. Now, of course, fewer people as a whole would be easier to manage from the environmental perspective, but what those people actually do, what lifestyle will they have, how much consumption, what kind of energy systems, and so on. And it's also, very hard for Americans to be talking about something like this because, look, we're some of the biggest consumers in history. So I don't think it's all that constructive to talk about like overpopulation and things like this when we're the most guilty environmental polluters in history. So we need to kind of look in the mirror and think about that first. But of course, the thing I would emphasize, and we do at Drawdown very much, is that there is still an unmet need for women and girls around the world to have family planning, good health care, and good education, to lift women and girls out of poverty into better health, into better education, into better opportunity. That is a good thing to do for its own sake, irrespective of what it means to global population. It's about human rights. It's about health. It's about being fair. It's also turning on half of the world's economy to the new level where we can have new ideas, new opportunities, new possibilities, and new thinking. Problems are rarely solved by the people who created them, and that's why it's so important that we don't just have a bunch of, middle-aged white guys like you and me being the only people talking about this stuff. We need at least half women in this conversation. We need many more people of color in these conversations. We have not done that well in our communities. We have to do better. So I would think not population is the issue. It's about human rights. It's about building the world that's just and fair and gives people opportunity. Then we'll see a good future.
I'm not going to ask another question because that was a wonderful ending. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you all for being here on behalf of this Minneapolis church community and the Central Minnesota chapter of the Climate Reality Project. We are so grateful that you spent some of your time this evening. This presentation is recorded and will be available at plymouth.org, plymouth.org, as well as Plymouth Congregational Church Minneapolis's YouTube page. It should be up fairly quickly in the next day. Thank you all. Spread that around. This is the way. This is the way that we help other people hear, learn, and then find places where their questions can be answered. Dr. Foley, I appreciate you greatly for all that you have done for us this evening and the work that you, your team, and the many other people like you and like us are continuing to do in the world. I do this for my daughter who is sitting right here, and I'm going to go put her to bed. May you all have a wonderful night.